sensitive data. There's a lot of complexities, but hopefully this will serve as an introduction. Before beginning, I'd like to acknowledge that this presentation is taking place on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, which encompasses the watershed of the Kitchissippi Big River, now commonly known as the Ottawa River. The Algonquin Anishinaabe have been here in the watershed for thousands of years, long before European contact, and will continue to be here well into the future. We recognize all Indigenous people in the region from all nations across Canada and dedicate ourselves to moving forward in the spirit of partnership and reconciliation. So just to speak to my experience working with sensitive data, I'm the University of Ottawa's Library Data Support Specialist in Research Data Management, RDM. I also served as the university's replacement RDM librarian, and I'm a committee member for the Digital Research Alliance of Canada's Sensitive Data and Preservation Expert Groups. In terms of working specifically with sensitive data, I've provided data management planning consults and currently curate the University of Ottawa's instance of the Borealis Research Data Repository. So I help researchers plan to ethically manage their data across the research lifecycle. My disclaimer for today is that I am not an REB member, privacy law expert, lawyer, or a specialist in healthcare data. So for that reason, I may or may not be able to answer your specific project questions at the end of the webinar. But if you do want more detailed project questions answered, do feel free to email me and or our library RDM department. We're happy to provide guidance and resources and referrals as needed. Okay, so diving right into an analysis of the Sensitive Data Toolkit in terms of who created it and why. It was created by the Portage network, founded in 2015, consisting of multidisciplinary researchers, librarians, and REB members across the country who helped establish National Research Data Management, or RDM best practices. Portage was previously under the umbrella of the Canadian Association of Research Libraries, CARL, so a library-intensive group, and is now under the aegis of the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, which has 3 streams to oversee Canada's digital research infrastructure to advance research computing, research software, and research data management. It's a sort of arm's length, federally funded nonprofit organization designed to support you, the researcher, across the research lifecycle. Sensitive data falls under the Alliance's Sensitive Data Expert Group of the RDM network of experts. It's going to be releasing an updated version of the toolkit, probably sometime this spring or summer, which has some changes to the previous year's versions, but is not drastically different from the version I'm presenting on today. So the toolkit itself consists of a 3-part suite of documents: the glossary of terms for sensitive data, human participant research data risk matrix, and research data management language for informed consent. If people would like to follow along at all from home, I'm happy to share the links here until the presentation is available in the chat. Okay, so there are also 2 supplementary resources that were created in response to data management needs for the duration of the COVID-19 pandemic, when people wanted to share their health data as quickly and safely as possible. These include the de-identification guidance, which I'll briefly review today, and the decision tree tool, Can I Share My Data? The toolkit was helpful on its release in 2020 and helping bridge the gap in understanding terminology, practices, and methodologies related to managing sensitive data, which can differ for different fields. The toolkit was designed to address those REB requirements relating to managing project data and to elaborate on some of the best practices that apply to sensitive data management. So in terms of the toolkit structure, talking about what is in scope and what is not, seeing sensitive data in the title may be a little misleading. What is in scope is human participant data. So if we're talking about humans and data, of course, that means TCPS 2, which includes Chapter 5 on privacy and confidentiality, and Chapter 2 on scope and approach. The toolkit applies the framework guiding TCPS 2 and breaks it down into practical steps we need to take to work ethically with participant data across the research lifecycle. In terms of what is out of scope for these documents, the toolkit doesn't address regional and local level policy governing sensitive data. So for example, provincial privacy law like FIPA and PHIP, as well as intellectual property law, by which we usually mean licensing and copyright for data. Indigenous data as well entail specialized ethical requirements for their handling, which are also not addressed by the toolkit. and for which there's still a great need nationally for more detailed guidance on best practices. And though the documents don't address these provincial and local requirements, they're designed to complement and not work against more local level guidance, such as provincial legislation or the CREX manual for ensuring privacy, confidentiality, and secure state data storage. Okay. So if we jump right into our first of a trio of documents, we have the glossary of terms for sensitive data. It harmonizes some of the different language and terminology used across different parts of the country in different legal jurisdictions. It summarizes terminology related to the latest RDM best practices that researchers need to be aware of to manage their human participant data ethically. It also defines and provides examples of terminology that populate the rest of the toolkit. And I do find it helpful in disambiguating some of those domain-specific understanding of processes for working with sensitive data, including for anonymization, de-identification, and pseudonymization, which can sometimes create confusion across different disciplines and research team members if everyone has a different or varied grasp of what we're referring to and speaking of related concepts. So for example, it defines de-identified data as the equivalent of anonymized data. And this aligns with TCPS2, which means that data are irrevocably stripped of direct identifiers, a code is not kept to allow future relinkage, and risk of re-identification of individuals from remaining indirect identifiers is low or very low. The glossary also helpfully flags the fact that we need to be aware of working with sensitive data that both directly and indirectly identifying information can pose risk and potentially constitute personal information. So things like demographic information, socioeconomic information, and geographic area could potentially constitute personal information. This understanding harmonizes also with legislation like PIPEDA at the federal level, as well as with most provincial legislation, which also stipulate that indirect identifiers can constitute personal information if there's a high risk of re-identification. So we might need support from RAB and privacy experts to tease out how that might apply to our specific project data. But it can empower us with a basic understanding that helps us determine how we want to store, collect, access, and use data across the research lifecycle. So getting to a more substantive part of the toolkit, which is the Human Participant Research Data Risk Matrix. Similar to the CREX manual, which I had a chance to peruse, I'm guessing most people here are somewhat familiar with as well. It classifies data according to the risk they might pose. So like the glossary, the risk matrix assessment aligns with TCPS2, and it assesses risks according to identifiability of the data, vulnerability of the data subjects as individuals or as part of a community or population, and sensitivity of the data in terms of their ability to cause harm. RAB will more definitively assess risks based on individual projects according to use cases and their discipline expertise. But the matrix can be helpful for project planning on how data will be collected, accessed, stored, worked with, and shared. It can be used for things like project planning, research design, writing grants, and creating data management plans or creating guides or manuals for more extensive research activities like labs. Assessing the risk data posed in the pre-research stage of the life cycle can help also with determining project budget as well as a project's overall feasibility. So this can alert us to roadblocks or challenges we might run into further along in the research process, even before RAB are involved, and help us pivot and adapt our original research design. For example, we might learn how complex our data management needs are and might decide to budget for an RA or a full-time employee to create a data management plan and help save hassles down the road. We might also realize the highly sensitive nature of our project data and realize we need a lot more time to meet with UAuto Central IT to determine storage solutions, ways to implement encryption and password protection, for example, and or set up a dedicated environment for storage. So the university will be publishing its own data classification framework, which is where local level recommendations come into play. The local level schedule aligns with the human risk matrix. It consists of the same categories: low, medium, high, and extreme risk data. The university will provide examples of data types like health data, student IDs, employee email addresses, for example, and where they fall in the matrix. So potentially you can match up your data via the university schedule, then follow Toolkit recommendations for working with the data risk types. And this university schedule falls under policy 117. That's where the schedule will live for the foreseeable future. The information currently available in this link is not up to date though, so please ignore what you see there until the release of the updated policy sometime, hopefully spring, summer of this year. At any given moment, as you likely know, data may move across risk categories, entailing different protocols for their handling. For example, data are processed, so identified data become de-identified data to move from a higher to a lower risk category. If data straddle two categories, which can often happen, for example, if they're coded but they're highly sensitive in nature, I'd suggest treating data as the higher risk level category if you're taking a more cautious approach. So the matrix tables serve a couple functions, which I found slightly confusing on first reading. But the first section defines the risk categories, and the sections that follow provide some guidance for their handling. Low risk data can include data that have no personally identifiable information, can include public data, data for which participants are not likely to be harmed if a breach were to occur, and they include data that were anonymous at the point of collection, so never had direct or indirect identifiers. Medium risk data pose slightly more risk. They can include de-identified data. In this category, the human participants involved are also not from an especially vulnerable population and would not be harmed if a breach were to occur. Data subjects in the high-risk category, though, may be vulnerable and might be harmed if a breach were to occur. This data also can include identifiable information, and the data may or may not be coded, but re-identification is still possible or probable. Extreme risk data may have been obtained from a third party, such as through REB-approved secondary reuse. It might include direct and/or indirect identifiers for which identification is possible or probable. And for this category, data subjects are vulnerable in the context of research and would be harmed if a breach were to occur. In terms of specific recommendations and guidance for working with the different data types, to obtain human participants' consent for use and reuse of their data. For low-risk data, letting participants know their data will be made available for future use may be sufficient. The same applies for medium-risk data. You might also want to give participants the option to opt out. High-risk data require that participants formally agree to their data sharing and use, and you'll likely need to put parameters around how data will be used in the future. Which brings us to data collection. This part of the table is a little confusing. It acts as both risk category definition and as guidance, which will actually be improved in the new released toolkit, which will more clearly delineate the table functions. But it reiterates that if we want data to be low risk, we shouldn't interact with participants or collect any identifiers, whether direct or indirect. Data fall into the remaining risk categories if we may know the identities of participants and/or have collected identifiers. Participants may also have been promised confidentiality, and there isn't any guidance here on best data collection practices, which is understandable as they can vary by discipline. But the data storage section does provide a little bit of general guidance that is discipline agnostic. Okay, so looking at data analysis of low-risk data should adhere to any REB protocol that might apply. For medium and high-risk data, we want to code collected data as soon as possible, make everyone's job as simple as we can, and avoid working with identifiable information. This means replacing direct identifiers with a linking code kept separate from identifying information, as well as from consent forms. And for data that are high and extreme risk, we also want to code those indirect identifiers, those that put participants at risk for re-identification. So taking that extra precautionary measure to look at risk in terms of those quasi or indirect identifiers like demographic information, free text responses, and geographic location. In terms of access protocols for these data types, the higher the risk, obviously the fewer research team members we want to give access. So we're just limiting the risk of breaches. And access should be on a secure network and/or on a non-network device. So one that's not connected to the internet. Ottawa Central IT, as people may know, are helpful and generally quite approachable on storage solutions for sensitive data for those working within the university, and can be approached as well by submitting an IT ticket. Okay, looking at data storage. For low-risk data, there are not many storage requirements in terms of sensitivity. You might want to consider using the 3-2-1 backup rule just to prevent data loss. which entails having 3 copies of data stored in 2 different locations, with 1 located off-site. For medium risk data, ideally we want password protected and encrypted files transferred via encryption methods such as liquid file, which you can access if you have a U Ottawa email address. Institutional cloud services like U Ottawa's instance of OneDrive are more secure than external cloud services like Dropbox, and that includes for cross-institutional collaboration. Faculty and students have access to up to 1 terabyte of OneDrive storage. For high-risk data, we want, again, password protection and encryption, both in transit and at rest. So when transferred via email or when stored, REB also need to approve any storage platforms we might plan to use. And for extreme risk data, the system might differ for different institutions and projects, but storage should consist of a dedicated controlled environment. A lot of thought, planning, and processes are involved. For example, we need REB to approve our data storage and sharing methods. And U Ottawa Central IT, again, are helpful in determining a dedicated system. For example, you might want to access the 5 terabytes of free storage available to U Ottawa faculty at Marion Data Center. Okay, this brings us to data sharing. There's a little bit of repetition from the previous table, but it reiterates that for low-risk data, there are no particular protocols for their sharing. For medium risk, we want that encryption and password protection. The same goes for high risk. Data should only be accessed by research team members specified in the REB protocol. The same applies for extreme risk data, and we should attempt to limit data access to the 1 or 2 project members who need it. For data deposit, there are few risks to sharing low-risk data if there are no other concerns attached to the data, such as relating to Indigenous communities or data with intellectual property concerns related to their reuse or sensitive geospatial data. If participants have given consent and have not opted out of data deposit, medium risk data can normally be shared in a repository in de-identified format, and we need REB approval for their reuse. If high-risk data are deposited to a repository, access should normally be restricted from the general public, although I'm not sure you would want to deposit high-risk data to a repository, but it might be possible with some approval process in place for granting access. Just like for medium-risk data, we need REB approval for their secondary reuse. And of course, we wouldn't normally deposit extreme risk data to any public-facing repository. So for data retention, possibly people here know we don't have rules at U Ottawa on destroying or retaining low and medium risk data for most individual projects. They aren't currently subject to U Ottawa's archives and information management schedule. But for higher risk data, REB normally determine what protocols, if any, apply to data retention and destruction. For the highest risk category, data generally are destroyed as soon as possible following REB protocols. So these are the last of the risk matrix recommendations. And this brings us to the last of our trio of documents, research data management language for informed consent. So if data were not anonymous at the point of collection, we want to inform participants about the scope of their data's future reuse, letting them know if data are limited to a defined use, for example, just for one project, or for extended use, more than just the project, but with some limiting parameters in place, such as limited to the same area of research, or for broad use, which might include use of participant data beyond the original field. Participants need to know what data, if any, as well as in what form their data will be shared, including the protocols that apply for their access. This includes letting participants know if their data will be preserved in a research data repository, in what form, such as de-identified, and for how long. For example, indefinitely, or when the project is no longer active, or for a time frame stipulated by REB. We can also provide details on what protocols apply for their data's reuse, such as if they'll only be accessed via REB approval, or if they'll be made more broadly available. We can provide details about the repository where participant data will be deposited, so we might list an example without committing to any in case we need to pivot to another repository. We also want to inform participants about the limitations to withdrawing their data. While they might easily withdraw from a study, they might face more limited options for withdrawing their data because they might already be anonymized, so irrevocably stripped of their original identifiers. But we can let participants know the limits for withdrawing their data and also let them know the processes and deadlines involved. You might want to include a brief signature acknowledgement at the end of the informed consent document, such as the example listed in the toolkit. summarizing what participants are agreeing to, and making it clear the summation of what they'll be agreeing to in contributing their data to the project. So moving on to the de-identification guidance, which is a fun, slightly more technical document, brings us to some coding and processing methodologies. It consists of a supplementary document created by a subgroup of the same Portage organization in response to the pandemic. People wanted to share their health data safely and quickly. Before even getting started on de-identification, the author suggests documenting these and any other processes applied to the data in an associated README file or related codebook to help future researchers understand the data. And I'm sharing the link to the Cornell University template, which we request researchers fill out. We're depositing their data in UOttawa's research data repository, so it can be a good benchmark for ensuring your data are reusable in the future. Something to maybe keep in mind is that different data require different degrees of processing. For example, data that are shared internally with protocols and security in place might only require pseudonymization, replacement of direct identifiers with the code, or they might require de-identification, that extra step which prevents re-identification, especially if they are highly sensitive and or if the data are going to be shared more publicly. The first step working with quantitative data is to code the direct identifiers, which many people here may already be doing, to work with data beyond the collection stage. These can be replaced with a series of codes linked to personal information kept physically and or electronically separate from the data. Then the de-identifying process requires us to evaluate the risk that any given data set's indirect identifiers might pose. Some considerations for risk include the study's geographic area. For example, a smaller city or region will be higher risk. Data whose participants represent the entirety of a population, a complete sample, will also be higher risk. For example, all members of a professional organization. We then want to evaluate indirect identifiers, including geographic identifiers and demographic information for risk. We could summarize potential risk with the first informal pass by looking at one row or observation in a data set and assess the risk that a given combination of indirect identifiers might pose. That's an abstract way of saying looking at one row, and to use the Toolkit example saying this individual lives in Toronto, is between 30 and 35 years old, and makes $50,000 annually. This would probably represent a low or very low risk of re-identification. Real-life studies, though, are more likely to include problematic indirect identifiers, though. For example, in this artificial UOttawa data set, we would say this individual works at the UOttawa School of Business, is 39 years old, identifies as white and non-binary, and makes between $70,000 to $90,000 annually. This data set would be quite worrisome, therefore, to share as is. It would not be challenging for a given individual to do someone's identity, and this would put participants and researchers at risk if they decided, say, to publish it in an open access repository. What we can do is implement a risk assessment methodology called checking for K anonymity. And it's a process which has garnered some positive attention in the last 5 to 10 years. We're specifically evaluating those indirect identifiers, which could put participants at risk of re-identification. So K is the integer, the number chosen to represent the number of rows or observations with identical values for those problematic indirect identifiers. In this slide here with an artificial data set, there are only 2 identical data rows, which would be fairly easy to do as participant identities. The way I think of it is K is the number of data twins or identical data rows a data set needs to protect participants' anonymity. So most researchers choose a K integer between 3 to 5. So for example, they will require the data set contain 3 identical records for problematic indirect identifiers. We should choose a higher integer of say 4 or 5 if the study represents a small sample or if it represents the entirety of a given population. Our synthetic data set is a small population and a complete sample of that population, so we would be worried. And we might therefore choose a K integer of 5. Then we could employ techniques to address these problematic quasi-identifiers. One option is to drop risky variables of the whole column, like demographic information that doesn't significantly contribute to the research study. Here we might choose to drop gender identity or ethnicity, but let's say the study is on gender and income inequality. We don't want to lose that valuable data that informs our research findings, maybe long-term informs meaningful policy. So another option would be global recoding. aggregating smaller or unique values into larger categories. So you could broaden the age range to 5 or 10-year intervals to protect participant anonymity. Here we could put the demographic information as between 30 to 40 years old, and maybe group the faculty into larger categories if they're not really informing our study. In some cases, we also want to perform local suppression. If there's a value that is an outlier, the example they provide is a young divorced individual, this could be replaced with a code like unknown or missing, so you don't have that single unique identifying value. So we would also want to check this data set for those outlier values. It's also a good idea to check for sensitivity of variables that are not what we typically think of as direct or indirect identifiers. Things like free text responses to surveys, opinions, free text medical history sometimes contain very risky personal information that individuals will share, having been promised confidentiality, and are not aware of how this information could be identifying. So we might want to replace these with codes and group these codes into larger categories because of they're often containing sensitive information. So once this is done, you want to retest for k-anonymity. So here our results are obviously engineered. It's rarely that simple or straightforward, but you can check using code included in the document, which works with the RStudio platform. It does involve some troubleshooting, playing around with the coding and the platform. AI can help a little with this kind of technical task. In the long term, it represents a time-saving measure in comparison with manually checking each value and variable, though it does take some time and wrangling. Also, it can be worth the investment if you think, for example, of the cost of liability that could result from data breaches. In our particular instance, we end up with a k-anonymity of 5, but we also want to consider the dataset sensitivity, such as vulnerability of the subjects and the risk of harm before determining what we want to do with the dataset, such as publishing it open access, and also have RAB inform us about recommended practices. As a follow-up, I recommend watching the McGill Anonymization Workshop series, to which I've referred a few researchers who have spoken to its usefulness. Most people aren't, I find, aware of indirect identifiers and the risk they can pose. We need more infrastructure in place to help this facet of the research ecosystem to promote safe data practices. It also provides some more details about using RStudio to check for k-anonymity, and includes a webinar on working ethically with qualitative data, for which there's still a lack of detailed guidance. So having thrown all this abstract information your way, as researchers, you likely want to know how these practices apply to your particular work or projects. One strategy is to create a data management plan, or a DMP. The Alliance has a number of templates and example DMPs on their platform called the DMP Assistant, in which you can outline the parameters for your data's handling. As you may already know, a DMP is typically a 1 to 2 page document outlining how data will be managed across the entirety of the research lifecycle. It can alert you to and prevent issues down the road, which we talked about earlier, such as data breaches, or help with confirming project feasibility. The platform itself is a web form. It allows for cross-institutional collaboration, onboarding of people from different organizations, and it's structured as a series of questions with prompts and guidance for each answer to apply best practices for handling sensitive data to a specific project or research activity. So that's all I wanted to say about the toolkit, providing the most general of overviews of that information.
Man, this is really important stuff, and I'm very grateful that we have your expertise to rely on. And I'm just mindful, we do a lot of teaching of research methods, but how valuable, especially with the shifting climate and it's technologies, it would be useful to integrate this into our training for students.